My job now is to introduce David Langstaff. David served as a chairman of the board of directors of TASC Incorporated upon its acquisition by General Atlantic Partners and KKR in 2009, until his appointment as president and CEO in 2011, and he remains a member of the board. TASC has more than 5,000 employees and 2010 revenue in excess of 1.6 billion, and is an independent company offering advanced enterprise engineering, integration, and decision support across the intelligence community, Department of Defense, and civilian agencies of the federal government. David was president, CEO, and director of Veridian Corporation from its formation in 1997 until its sale to General Dynamics in 2003. And the IPO of this company was recognized by the Financial Times as one of the 10 best global IPOs in 2002. So without further ado, let me give you David Langstaff.
Thank you. Well, I think, it's been fascinating just listening to the speakers already today. And I think everybody who has spoken has said something that I will sort of touch on here, resonate with, which means that I'm either very timely or all over the place. And I'm not sure which. And Mike, your talk, I feel I just watched and heard a 21st century update of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. It was quite remarkable and quite consistent. I do think it challenges the shareholder primacy theory, which perhaps we could talk about later on. But that's another discussion. So I've got a number of things to say. I know we're running late, and it's cocktail time shortly. But bear with me. Because this topic of rethinking shareholder value and the purpose of the firm, this is one which I've given a great deal of thought to. And it's almost where we need to start if we're to address some of the fundamental problems that are evident in society and our capitalist system. I appreciate this opportunity to share my thoughts with you and hopefully open a door as to how we move forward and move the discussion from the theoretical to the practical, from talk to action. So I applaud the Kellogg School of Management and Dean Blount for hosting this event. And knowing that we all stand on each other's shoulders and benefit from the interchange of ideas, I want to recognize one person here today who has been a catalyst for me. Judy Samuelson, earlier introduced as founder and president of the Aspen Institute Business and Society Program, which is a co-sponsor of this forum. And I've had the privilege of working with Judy for the better part of the last 15 years on this and related topics. So I've titled these remarks, Tomorrow's Corporation That We Need Today, and Getting There From Here. And I'll start by addressing why purpose is so important, looking at it from a number of perspectives. I think that will resonate with what some of the speakers in the panel earlier today laid out. And then I'll lay out some actions that, if taken, I think could drive us forward. And before closing, I want to touch on a couple of counterintuitive points which I think need to be considered if we're going to have a constructive dialogue. So the purpose of the firm. I believe that the lack of attention to this topic is one of the fundamental reasons why business finds itself near the bottom of the trust scale in society today. I think the last statistics were around 9%. How we address a corporation's purchase has far-reaching implications. It's fundamental to the kind of political and economic system on which our society is based, and the values we choose to bind us together. A question on the table is whether we, the business and financial community, can pull ourselves out of our self-absorbed, self-rationalizing pursuit of narrowly defined short-term self-interest to realize that we all have a permanent interest in preserving the system that has contributed so much good to society and which provides us with the freedoms that we now take for granted. So we need to remember history and reread a page from 19th century England. The tragedy of the commons occurred when individual farmers were permitted to graze their animals on the common lands. But There were no regulations to protect the land from overuse. And certain farmers profited by turning out more animals onto the common land to such an extent that overgrazing eventually rendered the commons useless for the community. The pursuit of unchecked individual self-interest destroyed the system. Today, corporate purpose is being held hostage by the myth of shareholder primacy. Society must decide whether it is to embrace a property or solely economic view of the corporation or a citizenship view. If we choose the property view, that the purpose of the corporation is for its shareholders, we are on a path to replay the tragedy of the commons, and we all lose. Even more tragic, in the long run, we destroy our own motivations, beliefs, and trust in each other and our institutions. It becomes our own Faustian bargain where we sacrifice our societal soul for short-term yet unsustainable gratification of the few. Now, if we embrace the citizenship view, we can regain the path where business is a trusted and responsible member of society, delivering for all of its constituents, including its shareholders. And this last point is important, for we cannot fall into the trap of thinking that the citizenship model is an anti-shareholder model. Such a belief would be a huge mistake. The great irony in the way this topic is debated is that in the long term, I actually would posit that both the property-based and the citizenship-based arguments converge in agreement. The real issues are the time frame in which one measures success and the priorities that drive near-term decision-making, and a more careful consideration of the rights of shareholders. I'll return to these points in a couple of minutes. So let us look at corporate purpose from three perspectives. The first is the law, secondly, good business practice, and thirdly, human motivation. I then want to suggest there's a fourth perspective that I believe can open the door to a constructive way forward. So why do companies exist, and for whom do they exist? Lynn Stout, who's over here, who will speak tomorrow, distinguished professor of corporate and business law at Cornell, is one of the foremost thinkers on this topic. And she has written, and I quote, "United States corporate law does not and never has required directors of public corporations to maximize shareholder wealth. To the contrary, as long as boards do not use their powers to enrich themselves, the law gives them a wide range of discretion to run public corporations with other goals in mind, including growing the firm, creating quality products, protecting employees, and serving the public interest. Chasing shareholder value is a managerial choice, not a legal requirement." Thank you, Lynn. The corporate charter is granted by society and provides, among other benefits, limited liability protection to the managers and owners of the corporation. The expectation is that in return for liability protection, other rights, the corporation will make a positive contribution to society. Edwin Gay, who is the founding dean of the Harvard Business School, stated that the role of the company is to do well for itself by doing well for society, to do both well and good, and for business leaders to make a decent profit decently. So today the question of corporate purpose plays out in the legal context in the debate between shareholders and multi-stakeholder primacy, or property and citizenship. There are many who would vehemently argue that the driving, even sole purpose of the corporation is to maximize profit for its shareholders. But let's be clear on this point. It was Milton Friedman, not corporate law, who wrote more than 40 years ago in The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits, that the sole purpose of the corporation is to maximize profit for its shareholders. Now, cases cited by supporters of the shareholder primacy theory include the 90-plus-year-old Dodge versus Ford and the more recent eBay versus Craigslist. But these cases actually don't make the point shareholder primacists want. Yes, a corporation should make a profit for shareholders, but the courts recognize and respect the business judgment of directors. And this business judgment standard allows for more balanced and reasoned considerations and actions. Practically speaking, in our litigious society today, it may be your safest of safe harbors to act to maximize profit for shareholders, but it is not your legal obligation. This legal distinction is certainly important for legal scholars. It's also important for business leaders and boards of directors to understand the basis on which the legal counsel they receive may be grounded. The business judgment standard opens a wide door and provides business all that it needs to operate in a responsible, citizen-oriented basis. In order to have the flexibility to operate in such a manner, I believe a business is well served to be clear about its purpose by which it creates a context for its own decision-making. Now, as an aside, let me say that I'm not convinced personally of the B Corp initiative. Not because it's bad to have multiple goals and stakeholders, or that the mission of the B Corp is not noble and good. And I know Bart Houlihan is here, or maybe here tomorrow. I look forward to talking with him about this. But I don't like what it tacitly allows or suggests about the C Corporation. As previously noted, I believe that corporate law, by way of the business judgment standard, gives the C Corporation the latitude to serve broader societal needs and consider multiple stakeholders. By saying we need the B Corp structure, are we effectively giving up on or giving a pass to the C Corporation as a responsible player when measured against society's long-term needs? At this point, I am not willing to make that assumption. So let me turn to the good business perspective. The legal framework is important because it creates space for a balanced consideration of a multiplicity of interests, but it doesn't compel action. I noted a minute ago my belief that the property and citizenship models actually converge in agreement, and I believe that pursuing a multi-stakeholder approach to running a business will, in fact, deliver the best returns to shareholders over time. The issue, of course, is time. This notion of time and the time frame over which positive results are to be delivered merits far more attention than it has received. The faceless market demands results now, or it will punish a company's stock price. At the same time, society wants to ensure that delivering results now for shareholders does not come at a far greater cost to society in the future, long after the shareholder beneficiaries have exited the stock. The lack of agreement on the appropriate time frame over which to measure performance is a major cause of the disconnect we face today around the role of business in society, and is likely at the root of problems, both real and perceived, that businesses face. Now, I'll be the first to note that delivering the best results to shareholders over time means that it may not deliver the maximum return to current shareholders next quarter. And this point takes us to the question of what constitutes good and responsible business. So what should the priorities of business be? What are the metrics of good business? Wall Street focuses on financial output metrics: profit this quarter versus last quarter, this quarter versus the same quarter last year, revenue growth, margins. And I don't argue that these metrics aren't important, but I will point out that these results are just that, results of doing other things very well. There's no business from which to derive a profit without customers. And to deliver for shareholders, every company first must ensure that the business continues to offer something that somebody wants to buy, and then focus on delivering for customers. I feel I'm channeling Harry Kramer from the panel this afternoon. The frequently cited example of this orientation is the pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson. Its credo, written by Robert Wood Johnson in 1943, just before the company went public, clearly lays out its priorities to put the needs and well-being of the people it serves first. It orders its constituents as follows. First, the doctors, nurses, and patients, mothers and fathers, and others who use its products. Second, its employees. Third, the communities in which it lives and works and the world community at large. And finally, its stockholders. And Johnson & Johnson states clearly that by operating by these principles and priorities, its stockholders will earn a fair return. Now, I had the privilege of building a billion-dollar national security company called Veridian in the 1990s and early 2000s. Just before we went public, I took a page from General Johnson's book and stated clearly our purpose, which was grounded in serving our customers in the government national security community and articulating a financial goal around creating sustainable long-term value for our constituents, including our shareholders. When we went public, I received some pushback from investment bankers on this message, but I insisted on making the point because I felt that it was essential that prospective investors understood our priorities and the context in which we would act in making strategic and day-to-day operating decisions. Today, I serve as the President and CEO of TASC. We are reestablishing ourselves as an independent company, having existed for the last 2 decades as a division of other companies, most notably Northrop Grumman. As a government contractor, we are taking these steps in a market environment that is facing gale force headwinds in the form of $1 trillion reduction in our customers' budgets over the next decade. We have established our purpose and vision and set a strategic intent that establishes TASC as the preeminent company at what we do: high-level enterprise and systems engineering, mission architecture and design in the national security and public safety markets. Our purpose is to strengthen the security and safety and thereby protect the basic values of society. Our vision is to be viewed as the most trusted, responsive, and valuable long-term partner of our customers, particularly during these difficult times. Our strategy requires time to play out. It's a strategy designed to build sustainable long-term value for our constituents, beginning with serving our customers better than any of our competitors. The performance metrics that matter to us are not the typical Wall Street trailing financial output indicators. Instead, they are the metrics that reflect industry thought leadership, high customer satisfaction, low employee turnover, increasing market share, and traction in changing our business model to delivering more solutions-based offerings rather than cost-based services. These are the metrics that will tell us if we are making progress in achieving our longer-term goal of building the leading company in our industry. If we can succeed against these metrics today, our financial investors will do just fine tomorrow. Now let me turn to the human side. What does it take to motivate human beings? If you're the sole proprietor of a business, do you think that you can motivate your employees for maximum performance by encouraging simply to make more money for you? That's effectively what an enterprise is saying when it states that its purpose is to maximize profit for its investors. Let me offer 2 examples to illustrate the point. First, think about leading a community-based volunteer organization. You don't have money, you don't have employment contracts, and often you don't have titles, but you still need everybody to contribute. Moreover, these days, nobody has time for anything, and everyone can simply walk away. So what holds people together in such voluntary organizations is a compelling purpose in which they believe and are vested. And on this point, I think Aristotle was right when he said that the human being is, by nature, a social animal, and is most fulfilled when engaging with others. There are great leadership lessons for business in understanding this simple point. Now, second, early in my career, I was part of starting a company called Space Industries, where I had the good fortune to work with some of the leaders of the nascent US space program, the people to whom President Kennedy turned to put a man on the moon: Bob Gilruth, Chris Kraft, Max Faget. Alan Shepard was one of our first shareholders, and later Neil Armstrong served as a director. I was struck by how these accomplished people would speak about the Apollo program, how it represented the most satisfying time of their lives. The reason is that they were contributing to something that mattered. They were part of a team pursuing a grand adventure that was bigger than any one of them. They had a sense of contribution, responsibility, and purpose that went well beyond their paycheck. A need at the most human level was being met. Now, I expanded on these lessons in building Viridian, and I bring the same approach to TASC. It is clear to me that a meaningful and shared purpose matters deeply, and it's the key to unlocking employee commitment, building a positive operating culture, enhancing productivity, and ultimately delivering exceptional performance. Most importantly, a clear purpose provides the foundation for institutional values. When your business depends upon attracting and retaining outstanding people, offering an environment where people are able to commit to a higher purpose than simply their jobs, and aligning institutional with personal values in such a way that neither is compromised, it's what the Apollo program did for those who worked on it in the 1960s. And it surprises me that more corporations don't see these connections nor see the benefits of addressing such a basic human need. Now, it may be helpful here to distinguish between the purpose of the firm and the nature of the firm. Those who think the purpose of the firm is to maximize shareholder value also typically think the nature of the firm is as an economic entity in which people are rational, economically self-interested actors. The purpose-driven, multi-stakeholder perspective that I embrace views people as social actors and views the firm as fundamentally a social institution as well as an economic institution. In these firms, the foundation of the firm is meaning, identity, and trust, rather than simply economic self-interest. And by creating a meaningful purpose, engaging employees and attending in a reliable and responsible way to the relationships with all stakeholders, corporate leaders can unleash higher levels of personal energy and establish relationships of trust, which in turn can enable their enterprises to outperform other firms over time. As work becomes more knowledge-based and as corporations build the capacity to collaborate across more complex boundaries, understanding the firm as a social institution becomes even more important. This line of thinking reflects the research of Mike Beer, Nathaniel Foote, and Russ Eisenstadt at TruePoint, and is articulated in their book, Higher Ambition: How Great Leaders Create Economic and Social Value. So my point is this. Together, purpose and values give you something to stand for in your life. Without knowing what you stand for, you're like a ship without a navigation system. You'll have no basis for your own ethical grounding, and therefore no basis for ethical decision-making. Institutions are no different. Clarity of purpose and strong institutional values mean you have the ends and means covered, and you've created the context and the foundation for a strong business that acts ethically, is a morally responsible member of society, and delivers for all of its constituents. So, I've touched on the topic of corporate purpose from the perspective of law, good business practice, and human motivation. I want to suggest there's a fourth perspective that I believe can open the door to a constructive way forward. And the fourth perspective is one of our own choosing. It's the needs and goals and basic values of the society in which we choose to live. So what, in fact, is our goal? One problem we have today is that we are still having too much of the conversations at the buzzword level. It's virtually impossible to gain traction around change until we get specific. We talk about corporate social responsibility, of long-term orientation, of serving multiple stakeholders, but what exactly do we mean? Before we address the proper or desired role of business in society, we need to be clear about what kind of society we want. What does a productive, just society look like? What is good And therefore, what does a responsible business look like? If you pick up any newspaper or check any current event website, you can only conclude that we don't like what we have today. Switzerland is proposing curbs on executive pay, and the European Union is discussing caps on bonuses. In the United States, we saw Occupy Wall Street movements across the country, and statistics that show that the top 1% received more than 100% of the economic gains of the last few years. So what do these factors reflect about our society today? Clearly, something's not working. So what kind of rebalance or realignment are we seeking? And perhaps most importantly, we need a shared societal view of what is just. What are the values we treasure and are willing to protect? And are there fundamental tenets of our society that we are willing to take steps to keep out of the marketplace? Now, the title I chose for this talk promises a way forward, how we get there from here. And I believe there are specific roles we need a variety of actors to play. To state the obvious, there's no one problem that needs addressing, and therefore there's no single silver bullet. We have a system that is out of sync, and excessive short-termism is a factor, but it is not the only factor. One of the lessons we learned over the years at the Aspen Institute Business and Society program is that everyone sees it as everyone else's fault. Initially, we convened CEOs who complained bitterly about the pressures of the market. In subsequent years, we convened CEOs and the leading institutional investors, and both complained about what the market forced them to do and the conflict between incentives promoting short-term performance and the rhetoric crying for long-term orientation. We asked whether there was a role for government to address these issues, and were met initially with a chorus of no. Interestingly, as the years have passed, a grudging recognition has taken hold that the challenges we face may be so large that the government does need to step in, that it has a role to play. This recognition led to the second set of Aspen principles entitled Overcoming Short-Termism that were unveiled in late 2009. Now, the situation in which we find ourselves now is that many public company CEOs dream of being private. Everyone feels trapped. The demands for performance now are so intense that the longevity of public company CEOs is barely 3 years on average. So what have we created? I'm reminded of the great line from Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, where the monster states, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." Is this where we are today? That we've created a remarkable system of capitalism to now find that it is our master? I, for one, believe we still remain in charge. And here's a way forward. My approach looks at 3 critical players. First, all of us as citizens of society. Second, the government. And by extension, the non-government fiduciary and regulatory institutions. And third, corporate boards of directors. Each must step up in a new way. And all of us, as citizens, must be clear about the kind of world in which we want to live and the values of our society that our principles of justice require be kept out of the realm of the market. We can't get the business and society part right until we address and decide what kind of society we want to have. The government then sets the rules, and from time to time adjusts the rules to deal with changing needs and desires of society. It is the role of government to protect the values its citizens deem important, to ensure equal opportunity is maintained, to ensure that the right rules and the right balance are in place to balance short and long-term goals and costs, and to make sure that the unintended negative consequences are addressed such that society operates within the boundaries of what is fair and just. By setting the rules, the government not only determines what is legal, but also puts in place incentives that can drive desirable corporate behavior. Where the government addresses rules and incentives at the macro level, boards of directors establish incentives to ensure performance and accountability at the level of individual corporations. And to do so effectively, boards need to become more engaged in strategy, not just compliance. Because strategy is a link between a clear purpose and vision and desirable operating results. Boards also must serve as more effective buffers between management and shareholders. Let me get more specific about what is required of each actor, and then revisit the property versus citizenship debate and the short-term versus long-term trade-off in this new context before wrapping up. So let's start with our responsibility as citizens in a democracy. I believe it was the great American philosopher Yogi Berra who observed, if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. I think you can tweak his comment to no path will get you there. It makes an obvious point, which is we complain about market forces, short-term pressures, shareholder primacy, yet we haven't come together to articulate the characteristics and values of the society in which we want to live. So what is the good today and for the future that we believe is important to be protected and that we want to see delivered? 150 years ago, we went to war over a commitment to end slavery. In the last century, we pushed for women's suffrage and basic civil rights for all Americans. We fought wars to protect democracy and freedom around the world. And now, with the knowledge we have at the start of the 21st century, we need to recalibrate again. We need to revisit such basic issues as wealth inequality, the hardening of strata in society that are leading to less economic opportunity and social mobility, and the degree to which we care and therefore will provide a soft landing for those that have less or none at all. Now, by confirming what is important to us, we create the context for enlightened leadership by all parties, elected officials, institutional leaders, and our corporations. And without this backdrop, how do we articulate specifically the role we want our corporations to play in society? It is in part the role and responsibility of government to reflect, protect, and enable the values of society. Throughout history, we've had periods of societal imbalance, often the unintended consequences of extraordinary progress in productivity gains, wealth creation, and an overall improvement in standards of living and quality of life. The technical and scientific breakthroughs of the Age of Enlightenment opened the doors to new discoveries, extraordinary invention, and ultimately led the way to the Industrial Revolution. Parts of the world witnessed huge increases in economic productivity, but also in employment. We saw great efficiencies in agriculture, but also the impoverishment of the environment. And in the last century, we've seen the development of modern conveniences, the automobile, air conditioning, air flight, but hand in hand with increases in pollution and industrial waste that threaten our environment and our health. So look at China today. Repeating history, but on a larger scale due to its size and overwhelming force of state capitalism. Around the world, we are driven to increase wealth, improve productivity, and increase near-term quality of life for some, but to ignore all the costs as well as those left behind. So every now and then, society must re-examine the values it holds and determine what is right and what is just. Adam Smith, considered by many as the father of laissez-faire capitalism, famously wrote in an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations in 1776 that an individual led by an invisible hand and by pursuing his own interest frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. Today, this attitude has been embraced by many and is translated into government stay out. But it was also Adam Smith who reflected on the unintended consequences of the extraordinary gains in productivity. About the division of labor, he wrote, The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The uniformity of his stationary life naturally corrupts the courage of his mind. And Smith goes on to say, but in every improved and civilized society, this is the state in which the laboring poor, that is, the great body of the people, must necessarily fall unless government takes some pains to prevent it. So even Adam Smith recognized the dark, unintended but inevitable consequences of great strides in productivity and economic gain, of progress, and the necessary role of the government in protecting those affected. So today the government has three roles to play. First, it must demonstrate that it cannot be bought, and that it can rise above parochial self-interest and begin to act more consistently and conscientiously in our shared national interest. The government must rebuild and re-earn the trust we need to have in our government. We heard this from Senator Feingold at lunch. Second, it must establish and enforce the laws required to protect the values of society. And third, it should introduce new regulations, policies, and other measures to incentivize the different behavior we desire to see on the part of business. And to this latter point, I'm not suggesting that the government try to curtail the market. Instead, it can co-opt it and let market forces drive different behavior because it makes economic and self-interest sense for such different behavior to occur. Market forces are powerful and cannot be ignored. And frankly, we cannot expect a groundswell of enlightened CEOs to make decisions that work against market forces. But the government can introduce changes that redirect market forces and therefore influence a different kind of behavior. Let me offer some examples. An inversely progressive capital gains tax that starts high and declines to zero over time, thereby encouraging more patient capital by creating an economic incentive to hold investments for a longer period of time. A transaction tax on the buying and selling of securities that would create an economic disincentive to frequent trading and churning. Differentiated voting rights among shareholders to favor those shareholders who have demonstrated a long-term commitment to a company from those who are in and out of the stock on a more rapid basis. An extension of the obligation of fiduciary duty to financial intermediaries, and modernizing our accounting system and required reporting metrics to reflect true costs of products and services, and to reflect the fact that our economy now includes companies that are knowledge-based, rich in intellectual property, or people-based, rather than just the asset-based businesses of earlier industrial ages on which our current system is based. Now, this last point is one of my hot buttons. If you start with the premise that more often than not you get what you measure, we ought to examine more carefully what we are measuring. It should be no surprise that we get what appears to be short-term profitable behavior if we don't have to measure or otherwise account for long-term costs. While there are government agencies that weigh in on these issues, the SEC being one example, there are also non-government institutions like FASB or the Public Company Oversight Accounting Board that also have a role to play. And let me suggest that this topic is one where business schools can play as well by challenging the adequacy of the systems we have today. The cold reality is that we aren't going to see responsible long-term behavior and avoid long-term harm if we choose to ignore long-term costs and impacts. Similarly, why are we surprised at the judgments being made about investments if we teach students and financial analysts to ignore difficult to measure or impossible to measure long-term costs when performing a discounted cash flow analysis? Once again, we get what we measure. Now let me turn to the role of the board. Although boards don't set the rules of the game, they do drive company performance by way of the expectations they set and the incentives they put in place at the individual company level. Roger Martin, the Dean of the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, and author of 2 recent books that touch on these topics, Fixing the Game and just recently Play to Win, commented a couple of weeks ago that if one could blow up the boards of directors of all Fortune 500 companies, we would see no degradation of value. Just the fact that Roger makes such a statement tells you we have a problem. Now, whether Roger is right or not, I believe there is an important role for a board to play. It's just that it's not being played. Many boards have fallen into the trap of believing their primary role is one of ensuring compliance. This role, while necessary, is insufficient. Boards must spend more time looking forward, not backwards. They must spend more time on matters of strategy and direction, and by doing so, they open up both time and space for responsible decision-making. The role of the board is to ensure that purpose, vision, and core values are in place, and then to give the CEO and executive team the time and space to act responsibly. Boards must understand and support company strategies, confirm the metrics that will indicate both success and progress, and hold the CEOs accountable for performance. Boards also must help CEOs counter the short-term pressures of the market and ensure that companies do not make short-term accommodating decisions that are not in the long-term interests as responsible contributors to society. To date, boards have become too compliance-oriented, are insufficiently grounded in company purpose, vision, and strategy, and are too quick to buckle to the short-term market pressures, thereby denying CEOs and executive teams the space necessary to run the company in a responsible fashion. So said another way, the boards of directors must step up to the whole job, not just the easy part. It's worth noting that if our aim is to find a better balance among short, medium, and long-term goals, and if we are committed to addressing more of the needs and expectations of multiple constituents, then boards of directors have an obligation to re-examine executive compensation through this lens. And I think we will find that the unconscionable levels of executive compensation at many companies can no longer be justified by what shareholders might approve under the property theory of the corporation. There's an ironic parallel that I just want to throw in. A board, one way to think about this, a board is to the shareholder in our current corporate governance construct what our elected officials are to the voting public in our democratic republic. In the same way that James Madison envisioned our elected representatives serving as a buffer against the potential tyranny of a pure democracy, the board of directors needs to protect management against the tyranny of vocal, active, short-term oriented shareholders. Today on this issue, neither our elected officials or our boards of directors are performing the job required of them. So before closing, I want to offer a few more nuanced thoughts on the debate around the property versus citizenship view of the corporation and the short-term versus long-term trade-off. We may be creating the wrong dichotomy when we position the property theory against the citizenship theory. As a long-term investor, your interests are aligned with society in that you want to see the continuation of a productive, healthy company that creates sustainable long-term value. Such a long-term investor has a seat at the table along with other stakeholders in the citizenship theory. All are united in their desires for sustainable long-term value to trump short-term, potentially damaging considerations, and all see the corporate institution as a desirable ongoing part of society. Similarly, the short-term versus long-term debate can be problematic in that at some point, the long-term we talk about today needs to be reflected in tomorrow's short-term. Said another way, prudent long-term decisions made today need to translate into economic value higher productivity, greater market share, consistent new product innovation, higher quality offerings, lower cost of capital, lower employee turnover, etc. These results benefit not only investors, but also society's sustaining interests. And clamoring for greater long-term focus cannot be an excuse for continuing poor short-term results. Further development of this idea takes us back to the need for greater transparency and the question of metrics, whether we have a system of measurement that fails to reveal long-term costs and implications, and therefore inappropriately biases decisions for the short term. The real issue is how companies make decisions. Are they made with the long-term interests of the company in mind, or are they made in a way that suboptimizes the creation of long-term value due to short-term market pressures or demands of short-term investors? Consideration of this opens the door to the topic of executive compensation again, and more fundamentally executive tenure, which in turn takes us back to the points raised in the discussion of the role that boards of directors need to play. I keep on my desk one of the statements of Confucius. It reads, "To know what is right and not to do it is the worst cowardice." And I think it's right to put this discussion in a moral framework and not just consider it as an economic one. People across the United States and around the world are saying today that things aren't right. They aren't fair. There are too many undeserved winners and undeserving losers. We've come to accept so much money in politics that we politely call what is legalized corruption, lobbying, and campaign finance. We have become beaten down by forces that we claim we don't control and which we believe are wrong, yet we accept them. "You are my creator, but I am your master," said Shelley's monster to Dr. Frankenstein. Is this really where we are with the market forces of capitalism? We created the system, but now it controls us. The fact is, we hide behind the notion that market forces act on their own, and how they act is not our fault. Market forces, in fact, are amoral, not immoral. And it is we, the humans, who must bring a morality to our society. But we should not fool ourselves into thinking that markets can be made moral. We must be the ones to say where the market can play and where it must stop so that life is governed by other values. Arthur Okun, the economic advisor to President Johnson, noted in his 1975 book, Equality and Efficiency, the Big Trade-Off, and I quote, "Society needs to keep the market in its place because given the chance, it would sweep away all other values and establish a vending machine society." That was 1975. And wasn't it George Will who famously wrote many years ago that the welfare state is the price we pay for free market capitalism? So society will push back and insist on new laws and regulations that, if history is to be our guide, will likely be poorly thought through yet passed into law in an effort to protect what it considers important. The business environment will only become more difficult. Business has a choice. We have a powerful long-term self-interest to act before new restrictive rules are imposed and re-win the confidence of society. Or we can simply wait and see what will be imposed. If we take the latter approach, I think we run a high risk of witnessing our modern day version of the tragedy of the commons play out. Each party acting in accordance with its own short-term self-interest, with no one taking responsibility for the commons. As the Honorable Leo Strine, the Chancellor of the Delaware Courts, has noted, we don't have time to relearn the lessons of the 19th century. So we need a worldview, a goal we share about the kind of society in which we want to live and be part. Arguably, this is what our elected officials should be addressing, and the laws and policies we have should reflect the values we share, the limits we believe need to be set for everyone, and the safety net we believe to be just. It is not clear to me that our politicians will or can agree on a shared vision. In fact, it would appear that we are in a war of fundamentally different visions for the future and what constitutes a just society. So despite these obvious challenges, business should not be given a free pass. I believe that every business should articulate clearly what it sees its role to be and the contribution it will make to society. It can do this, of course, through a clear statement of purpose. Similarly, if we shared a common worldview, it would be easier for us to outline the role and behaviors of business in the society we seek to build. Absent a consensus, a business can articulate its chosen path and the contributions it will make in its vision. I believe a clear purpose is an essential building block in the foundation of a more responsible capitalism. You can't achieve your purpose in a quarter or a year. It serves as a statement of why a company exists, and more fundamentally, why a company merits having a corporate charter and receiving the protections and benefits that society provides. Absent a worldview of the kind of society we want to have, it is every company's opportunity and responsibility to articulate the contribution it seeks to make to society and to the improvement of life on Earth. Thank you. I am in integrity because it's less than an hour.
I got the message.
No, you gave it to all of us.